Picture this. You're a Chinese company making electric buses that are better, they're cheaper, they're more reliable than anything the competition can offer. So naturally you are winning contracts left, right and center. Cities are happy, passengers are happy, and you're thinking, bloody hell, this capitalism business, it's quite nice, isn't it? But then suddenly, and I mean suddenly, the government declares your bus is a national security threat. Not because they caught your buses secretly recording conversations or transmitting data to Beijing, no, because local manufacturers can't compete with you and they've got better connections than you do. Welcome to the absolutely mental world of India's BYD bus ban, where national security becomes the most expensive lie ever sold to taxpayers. I'm Andy Roberts, and this is The Fine Print, where we dig into the corporate bollocks that governments hope that you're too busy to notice. Today's story, how India's government decided that protecting domestic bus manufacturers was worth disguising as patriotism, and why you should be absolutely livid about it. So let's rewind to 2017. India's got a problem. Their cities are choking on pollution, and their public transport is, to put it kindly, absolutely dreadful. The government launches this ambitious plan to electrify public transport. Brilliant idea, actually. Clean buses, reduced emissions, happier commuters. What could possibly go wrong? Enter BYD, Build Your Dreams, a Chinese company that had spent years perfecting electric bus technology, while most other manufacturers were still figuring out how to make it bloody work. And here's where it gets interesting. BYD wasn't just competitive, they were dominant. Their buses had ranges of over 300 kilometers on a single charge. Indian manufacturers, most were struggling to get past 150. BYD buses came with proper air conditioning that actually worked, comfortable seating, and reliability that meant buses actually showed up when scheduled. Revolutionary concepts, I know. But here's the kicker. They were also cheaper. Not slightly cheaper, significantly cheaper. We're talking about BYD buses costing around 2.5 crores, while comparable Indian buses were pushing 3 to 4 crores. Now, for those of you wondering what the bloody hell a crore is, it is 10 million rupees, or roughly $120,000. Think of it as India's way of making everything sound more dramatic. Why say $12 when you can say 1,000 rupees? It's brilliant marketing, really. Anyway, in a country where every rupee matters for public spending, this should have been a no-brainer. Cities started placing orders. Ahmedabad, Hyderabad, Mumbai, everyone wanted a piece of this action. BYD was setting up manufacturing in India, creating jobs, transferring technology. By 2019, they'd delivered over 500 buses and had orders for thousands more. Indian passengers were actually happy with their bus journeys. When was the last time you heard that? Now, if you think Indian bus manufacturers were sitting quietly while this Chinese upstart made them look like amateurs, you clearly haven't been paying attention to how business actually works. Companies like Tata Motors, Ashok Leyland, and others were getting absolutely hammered in their own backyard. And when domestic companies start losing money to foreign competition, they don't innovate fast or improve their product. No, of course not. That would be work. Instead, they pick up the phone and start making some very expensive phone calls to very important people. The lobbying began in earnest around 2019. Industry associations started publishing reports about the dangers of relying on Chinese technology. Newspaper articles began appearing about the strategic risks of foreign dependence. Politicians started giving speeches about Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India. But here's what's absolutely mental about this whole charade. These same Indian manufacturers were using Chinese components in their own buses. Tata Motors was importing batteries from China. Ashok Leyland was sourcing electric motors from China. The only difference was BYD was being honest about where their buses came from. And speaking of those Indian alternatives, let's talk about what taxpayers were actually getting for their money. Tata's electric buses had a nasty habit of breaking down more frequently. Ashok Leyland's buses had range issues that meant they couldn't complete full routes without stopping for a charge. But hey, at least they were Indian failures, right? Now, before we dive into how the government decided to solve this problem, smash that like button if corporate protectionism disguised as patriotism makes your blood boil as much as it does mine. Oh, and subscribe, because trust me, we're just getting started with stories that will make you question everything. So then came 2020, and suddenly the Indian government discovered something shocking. Chinese products might be used for surveillance. I know, who could have possibly seen this coming? It's not like China had been manufacturing electronics for decades or anything. The Galwin Valley crash between Indian and Chinese troops provided the perfect excuse. In April 2021, the Ministry of Power quietly issued guidelines stating that government-funded organizations would need prior approval to procure powered equipment from countries sharing a land border. Coincidentally, this applied to exactly one major bus manufacturer, BYD. But here's where the government story starts falling apart faster than a cheap umbrella in a monsoon. If this was really about national security, why were these buses, which were already delivered and operating, not immediately recalled? Why were Chinese-made components in Indian buses still perfectly fine? Why was the ban only on complete buses and not on the Chinese batteries, motors, and electronics that Indian manufacturers were still happily importing? Because this was never about national security. This was about market protection, pure and simple. The timing was absolutely perfect for Indian manufacturers. BYD had just won a massive tender for 5,000 buses across multiple cities. The contracts were worth over 12,000 crores. That's roughly $1.5 billion. Indian manufacturers were about to lose the biggest electric bus contract in the country's history. Suddenly, overnight, those contracts became null and void. So what happened next? The same tenders were reissued, but this time with the Chinese competition conveniently eliminated. Indian manufacturers, no longer facing serious competition, started quoting higher prices. Much higher prices. Buses that BYD were providing for 2.5 crores were now being quoted at 3.5 to 4 crores by Indian companies. The quality hadn't improved. If anything, it had gotten worse because there was no competitive pressure to innovate, but the prices, oh, they went through the bloody roof. Let's do some quick maths, shall we? If India procures 50,000 electric buses over the next 5 years, which is their stated goal, and each bus costs 1 crore more than it should do due to lack of competition, that's an extra 50,000 crores of taxpayer money. That's about $6 billion of pure waste. And you thought the British government was bad. But it gets worse. Remember how BYD buses had better range and reliability? Well, the Indian alternatives still don't match those specifications. Cities are getting buses that can't complete full routes, breaking down more frequently and providing a worse passenger experience. So, taxpayers are paying more money for worse buses. But hey, at least they're patriotic about it. Now, the government couldn't just admit they banned BYD to protect domestic manufacturers. That would be political suicide. So they doubled down on the national security angle with all the conviction of a politician promising lower taxes. They started talking about data security, about buses potentially being used for surveillance, about the dangers of foreign dependencies. It all sounds very serious until you realize that the Indians are still using Chinese components, Chinese software, and Chinese manufacturing equipment. But the most ridiculous part, BYD had offered to manufacture everything locally in India with local partnerships, local employment, even local R&D. They were literally offering to become an Indian company in everything but name. But apparently that still wasn't Indian enough. Meanwhile, the same government that was worried about Chinese surveillance in their buses was perfectly happy to allow Chinese smartphones to dominate the Indian market. Because apparently a phone that's literally always listening to you and tracking your location is somehow less of a security risk than a bus that drives in a straight line. The logical consistency here is about as solid as a chocolate teapot. So here's what really happened. Indian bus manufacturers couldn't compete on price, quality, or innovation. So instead of improving their products, they lobbied the government to eliminate the competition. The government, happy to protect domestic industry and look patriotic while doing so, banned BYD under the guise of national security. The result? Indian taxpayers are now paying billions more for buses that are objectively worse than what they could have had. Cities are struggling with unreliable public transport, and the environment is suffering because fewer electric buses are actually being deployed due to higher costs. But the domestic manufacturers are happy. The politicians look patriotic, and everyone involved in this decision has convinced themselves they're heroes of this story. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how corporate greed gets dressed up as national security. This is how you make the public pay premium prices for inferior products and call it patriotism. The most infuriating part, this same playbook is being used around the world in every industry you can think of. Kind of like how Volkswagen got caught cheating emissions tests and has been directly tied to 4,000 deaths in the US. You can watch all about that in this video here, because you've probably seen the ads about recalls. I'm Andy Roberts, this has been The Fine Print, and remember, every time someone says it's about national security, check who's getting richer while you're getting poorer.